My mother's face filled my screen pale in a way I'd never seen before, and for a second, she looked less like the woman who ran our family like a tight ship, and more like someone who'd just watched the floor give out under her feet. Behind her, Christmas music was playing too loud, some syrupy chorus fighting with the sound of five kids shrieking over each other, a toy clattering across hardwood, someone sobbing because something sticky had spilled on something new. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth like she could hold the panic in her eyes, darting off camera, then snapping back to me. Her voice came out thin and sharp. "What? No, this cannot be happening." I didn't answer right away. I just kept breathing slow and steady while I listened to the chaos that used to swallow me whole every holiday. Then my mother looked at something on her end, maybe a message, maybe the empty space where she expected me to be, and she gasped again, louder this time, like the air had been punched out of her. "What? This cannot be happening." I should tell you right now, I wasn't proud of how calm I sounded in that moment. Not because I wanted anyone to suffer, not because I hated children, not because I'd suddenly become some heartless daughter who didn't care about her parents, but because the calm didn't come from cruelty. It came from something I'd never had before: control. My name is Lauren. I was 29 that Christmas, living outside Raleigh in a small apartment I paid for myself with a job in project management that taught me how to keep my voice even when everything around me was on fire. I didn't have a husband, I didn't have kids, and in my family that meant one thing: I was flexible. I used to think flexible was a compliment. Like I was the capable one, the dependable one, the steady one. I used to take pride in being the person everyone called when something fell apart. I used to think that's what love looked like: showing up, filling gaps, making sure everyone else got what they needed. Over time, I learned flexible didn't mean capable. It meant available. It meant movable. It meant my plans were pencil, everyone else's were ink. And if you're listening to this and you know that feeling, the way people look at your time, like it's a spare room in their house, something they can borrow whenever they want, then you already understand why that gasp on my screen didn't start on Christmas Eve. It started weeks earlier with one phone call that made my stomach drop, and then for the first time in my life, instead of swallowing it, I let it sit there in my throat until it turned into something harder. It started with my mother's voice, sweet as pecan pie, coming through my phone like a familiar trap. "Lauren, honey, I have the most wonderful plan for Christmas," she said, and I could hear the smile in her tone, the way she was already building the scene in her head, already placing everyone where she wanted them. I was at my desk when she called, still in the office, even though the lights in most of the building were dimmed for the evening. My computer screen was a mess of spreadsheets and timelines, the kind of work that didn't care what season it was. I'd been putting in extra hours for months, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I was saving. I had a plan of my own. A quiet, private plan I'd kept tucked inside me like a small flame. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the window, the dark reflection of my own face looking back at me. My mother's voice kept going bright and quick. "Your brother and your sister-in-law are bringing the kids, and your cousin Tessa is coming with her little ones too. And, you know, your father and I have so much to do. Hosting is so much work. And we were thinking you could just watch the children for a couple of days so the rest of us can get everything ready," she said, like she was talking about asking me to pick up ice. A couple of days? 5 kids. 2 under 4, one who still took naps like a ticking time bomb, and 2 older ones with the kind of energy that turned living rooms into obstacle courses. I stared at the calendar taped beside my monitor, the dates circled in red that I'd been counting down to. It wasn't a party. It wasn't a dinner reservation. It was something I'd been planning since summer. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice gentle because old habits die hard. "I told you I already had plans for Christmas." There was a pause, just long enough for her to reset the script. Then she gave a little laugh like I'd said something silly. "Oh, sweetheart, of course you do," she said. "But you can move them. It's not like you have anyone depending on you. You're flexible." There it was, the word that always landed like a slap. I felt heat rise in my chest, not the kind that makes you cry, but the kind that makes you go very still. I looked down at my hands on the desk, my fingers wrapped around a pen so tight it left a dent. I do have people depending on me, I said quietly. My job depends on me. I depend on me. My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a scoff. Lauren, don't start, she said, and I could hear the shift sweetness thinning into impatience. Everybody has real responsibilities. Your brother has a family. Tessa has those kids. Your father and I are getting older. We can't do all of this and chase children. You're the only one who can handle it. Handle it. Like the kids were a mess she expected me to clean up. Like my life was an empty room she could store things in. I swallowed. I could have said no right then. I could have shut it down, could have told her my plans were set, my tickets were bought. My time was mine. But when you grow up with a mother like mine, you learn early that no is not a word. It's a challenge. No means tears, guilt, phone calls to relatives, disappointment thick as syrup, and the cold silence that follows when she doesn't get her way. So instead of no, I heard myself say the words I'd used my whole adult life. Let me think about it. My mother didn't miss a beat. You don't need to think, she said briskly. You know what the right thing is. We're counting on you. Then she hung up like the conversation was done, like my answer was already written. I sat there in my office chair for a long time after the call ended, staring at the blank space on my screen, listening to the hum of the building, the distant whir of the copier down the hall. Counting on you. The truth was, they always were. Not because I was the best with kids, though I was fine. Not because I loved babysitting, though I loved the children in the way you love people you're supposed to love. They counted on me because I had never made them count on themselves. That thought scared me. Then, like a second thought sliding into place behind it, something else followed, colder and clearer. What if I stopped? I could feel my pulse in my throat. My mouth was dry. I picked up my phone and stared at it. I could call my mother back and argue, cry, plead, explain, bargain. I could fall into the same groove I'd been sliding down since I was 14, when my mom started leaving me in charge of younger cousins during family parties, telling everyone what a blessing I was, what a help, what a good girl. Or I could do what I almost never did with my family. I could call someone who didn't benefit from me being easy to use. I tapped my friend Dina's name. She picked up on the second ring as if she'd been waiting. You sound like you're clenching your jaw, she said. No hello, no warm-up. What did she do? That was Dina. Blunt, loyal, the kind of woman who'd survived her own family and didn't romanticize mine. I told her everything, pacing the narrow hallway outside my office suite, my heels clicking against the tile. My mother's plan, the 5 kids, the couple of days the way she'd said flexible, like it meant disposable. When I finished, Dina exhaled slow. She volunteered. You didn't, Dina said. Not exactly, I admitted, then felt stupid as soon as I said it because my mother didn't need my yes to make it real. She needed my silence. Lauren, Dina said, you know what she's doing. She's building the whole holiday around the assumption you'll cave. I leaned my forehead against the cool wall. My eyes stung not from tears yet, but from exhaustion. She said, everyone has real responsibilities, I whispered. Dina let out a humorless laugh. That line should come with a warning label, she said. You work. You pay your own bills. You take care of yourself. That's real. They just don't respect it because it doesn't serve them. I didn't answer. My throat felt tight. Then Dina said something that made my stomach flip. What are your plans, exactly? I hesitated because my plans weren't just a weekend away. They weren't something I'd posted about or talked about in the group chat. I hadn't told my family for a reason. Every time I let them in on something I wanted, it became a group discussion about whether I deserved it. I kept my voice low. I put a deposit down on a cabin in Asheville, I said. Just me. Quiet. No cooking for 20 people, no cleaning. I'm taking the week off. I've been saving for it since July. There was a beat of silence and then Dina's voice softened. Good for you, she said. Don't you dare give that up. I swallowed hard. It's just, I started and Dina cut in. No, Lauren. Not just. 5 kids is not just. 2 days is not just. It's never just because it's never only the babysitting. It's the assumption. It's the entitlement. It's them getting to feel like their lives matter more than yours. I stood there with my eyes closed, feeling the truth in her words, like a bruise you can't ignore. Dina continued, and I could hear her sitting wherever she was, probably at her kitchen table with a cup of tea steady as a rock. Let me guess, she said. She already told someone you'd do it. My stomach dropped. I didn't know yet, but the way my mother had hung up, the way she'd sounded so certain, it made sense. I went back into my office, sat down and opened the family group chat. I hadn't checked it all day because work had been relentless. The thread was already buzzing, Christmas tree emojis, pictures of matching pajamas, my mother posting paragraphs, like she was writing a newsletter. Then I saw it. Lauren will be with the kids so the rest of us can focus on getting everything ready, my mother had written. Thank goodness for her. We'd be lost without her. My heart thudded once hard. She hadn't even waited for me to answer. Replies stacked under it. Perfect, my brother wrote. I really needed a break. You're the best, Tessa added. The kids love you. Not a single person asked if I agreed. Not a single person checked. I felt something in me shift like a door clicking shut. I typed a response, deleted it. Typed again, deleted it again. My hands were shaking now, not with fear, but with a kind of clarity that made everything else look blurry. I heard Dina in my ear like she could see the screen through my eyes. She already built the holiday around you caving. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I wondered what would happen if I let her build it all the way, right up to the moment she realized the foundation wasn't there. I didn't send a fight. I didn't send a speech. I sent the most neutral message I could. Got it, I wrote. I'll check my schedule and let you know. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and stared at the wall, breathing like I was trying not to drown. Because that message wasn't a promise. It was something else. It was me buying time not for them, but for myself. The weirdest part was how quiet the room felt after that, like the world was holding its breath with me. I packed my laptop, turned off the desk lamp, and walked out into the cold night air. The parking lot smelled like rain and pine, and my breath came out in thin clouds. On the drive home, my mother called twice. I didn't answer. At home, my apartment was dim, and still the kind of stillness I'd always treated like a waiting room, because in my family being alone was seen as empty. That night, it felt like space. I kicked off my shoes, poured a glass of water, and walked into my bedroom, where a small suitcase sat half-packed in the corner. I'd started packing weeks ago quietly, like I was afraid even the zipper sound would travel through the air and back to my mother. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at it. The cabin reservation email was open on my laptop, the confirmation number bright on the screen, the dates highlighted December 23rd through December 27th. The exact window my mother wanted me, trapped in her house with 5 kids and no say. My phone buzzed again, and when I looked, it wasn't my mother this time. It was a text from my brother. Hey, just checking you'll be there early Christmas Eve, right? Mom said you're taking the kids. I stared at the message until my eyes burned. I could feel the old pattern trying to pull me under, the automatic urge to explain, to soften, to fix. Instead, I set the phone down and opened a blank note on my laptop. I started typing a list. Not a dramatic list, not a revenge fantasy. Just facts. Every holiday I'd spent tired, resentful, smiling anyway. Every time someone said you're so good with them and meant we don't want to do it. Every time my mother used the words real responsibilities. The list got long fast. I didn't realize how much I'd swallowed until I saw it laid out in plain black text. When I finished, my hands were trembling again. I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the mirror in my bathroom. I looked at my own face, the way my jaw was tight, my eyes wide. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "I am not flexible. I am a person." Then my phone rang again, and this time I knew it was my mother before I even looked, because only she called with that kind of relentless certainty, like she could wear you down by sheer repetition. I let it ring until it stopped. I didn't feel brave. I felt sick. But underneath the sickness was something I couldn't unfeel now. If I answered, the script would start again. So I didn't. I went back to my bedroom, pulled the suitcase closer, and started folding clothes with slow, careful hands. Each shirt I placed inside felt like a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration. A knock came at my door an hour later. It startled me so much I almost dropped a sweater. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw Dina holding a paper bag, her hair pulled up, her face set like she was ready for battle. I opened the door and she walked in, like she belonged there, because in a way she did. "I brought you dinner," she said, lifting the bag. "Because I know you'll forget to eat when you're spiraling." I let out a shaky laugh that sounded more like a sob. Dina set the bag on my counter and turned to face me, her eyes scanning my apartment, then landing on the suitcase. "So," she said, "is it still half-packed because you're going, or half-packed because you're hoping someone forces you to stay?" That question hit so close to the truth my knees went weak. I sat down at my little kitchen table, and Dina sat across from me unwrapping a sandwich like it was normal to stage an intervention on a Tuesday night. I told her about the group chat, I said. "She already told everyone I'm doing it." Dina shook her head slowly like she was watching a bad movie she'd seen too many times. "That's not a plan, Lauren," she said. "That's a trap." I picked at the edge of my napkin, my appetite gone. "If I tell her now," I said, "she'll make it a whole thing. She'll cry. She'll call my aunt. She'll tell everyone I'm selfish." Dina leaned forward. "And if you don't tell her now," she said, "she'll learn something she's never learned before." I looked up. "What?" Dina's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "She'll learn that she can't build her world on your back without asking you first." The air between us felt heavy. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the faint sound of traffic outside the ordinary life I lived when my family wasn't pulling me into their orbit. I thought about Christmas Eve, about my mother's house, the smell of cinnamon candles, the kids running in circles, my mother smiling for pictures, while I stood off to the side, watching someone else's joy. I thought about the cabin in Asheville, the cold mountain air, the quiet, the chance to wake up without being needed. Then I thought about that gasp I'd just heard in my imagination, the moment my mother realized the safety net wasn't there. I hated how tempting that image was. Not because I wanted her to suffer, because I wanted her to see. Dina watched my face like she could read the battle happening behind my eyes. "You don't have to be cruel," she said. "You just have to stop rescuing them from the consequences of their choices." I swallowed, my throat tight again. "I'm scared," I admitted. Dina nodded like fear didn't surprise her. "Of course you are," she said. "They trained you to be scared. It keeps you useful." That line landed and stayed. I didn't answer Dina after that, not right away. I stood up, walked to my bedroom, and picked up my phone. I opened my mother's private chat, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could end it now with a single sentence: rip the bandage off early, give them time to scramble. Or I could do what they'd always done to me, assume I'd figure it out. My hands shook so hard I had to press my palms flat on the bedspread to steady them. Dina appeared in the doorway behind me. "Whatever you decide," she said, "make sure it's something you can live with on the other side." I stared at the blank message field, my heartbeat loud in my ears, and for the first time I admitted the truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't just about Christmas. This was about the rest of my life. I put the phone down without sending anything, not yet, and I reached for my laptop instead. The cabin reservation page was still open, the final payment button waiting like a dare. I stared at it, then at my suitcase, then at my own reflection in the dark window. Outside, the first real cold of winter pressed against the glass. Inside, something in me was warming up, something dangerous and new. And I could feel it even then, the moment before everything changed, the thin line between the woman I'd always been and the woman I was about to become. I clicked the button. The next morning, I woke up with that strange hollow feeling you get after you do something bold in private, and the world has not reacted yet. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually made me reach for my phone just to fill the space, just to make sure I had not missed a crisis that needed me. My body moved on habit: coffee, first hair, up, slippers on, but my mind kept circling the same thought. I had made a decision that could not be undone, and no one in my family knew it yet. My phone was face down on the nightstand, exactly where I had left it, like a sleeping animal I did not want to wake. When I finally flipped it over, the screen lit up with a row of notifications that made my stomach tighten. Missed calls from my mother, a couple of texts from my brother, and a handful of group chat messages with the same bright holiday energy that always felt like a performance. I did not open anything right away. I stood there in my kitchen, holding my phone in one hand and my mug in the other, staring out at the gray morning through the window over my sink. The trees were bare. The air outside looked cold and still, and for a moment I had the odd sensation that my life was split in two. In one version, I was already trapped in my mother's living room, with 5 kids climbing over me while everyone else drifted in and out with hot cocoa and laughter. In the other version, I was standing in my own kitchen on my own time, and no one could reach in and rearrange me without my permission. The guilt tried to show up anyway. It always did. It was like a muscle memory, like my heart had been trained to ache the moment I sensed anyone in my family might be disappointed. I took a sip of coffee, too hot, and forced myself to breathe through it. When I opened the group chat, the first thing I saw was my mother's message from late last night, the one I had already read, but could not stop rereading because each time it hit a different nerve. Lauren will take the kids so we can focus on hosting. Thank goodness for her. We would be lost without her. Lost without her. It should have sounded like appreciation. It used to. When I was younger, being called helpful felt like being loved. It felt like having a place. But now all I could see was the way that sentence erased me as a person and turned me into a solution, a resource, a spare set of hands. Under it, my brother had replied with a thumbs up and a line about how he and his wife were desperate for a break. Tessa had sent a string of heart emojis and said, "You are a lifesaver." My father had posted a picture of the Christmas tree half lit, like everything was already underway. Not one person said, "Lauren, are you sure?" Not one person asked, "Does that work for you?" Not one person even hinted that my time belonged to me. I scrolled further and saw my own message, the neutral one I had sent, the one that felt like a pebble dropped into a lake. "Got it, I will check my schedule and let you know." My mother had reacted to that with a cheerful, "Perfect, honey, you always come through." Always. That word landed heavier than flexible. Always meant forever. Always meant I was expected to stay in the same role no matter how old I got, no matter what I built for myself, no matter what I wanted. My phone buzzed in my palm. A new message came through from my brother. "Hey, just confirming you will be at Mom's by mid-morning Christmas Eve, right? We are dropping the kids early so we can run errands." Dropping the kids early. He did not say, "Would you mind?" He did not say, "Can we talk?" He spoke like I was a daycare service with set hours, like he could schedule me the way you schedule a delivery. A familiar heat flared in my chest. My first instinct was to reply quickly, to smooth it over, to explain. That instinct had saved me from conflict so many times, but it had also trapped me. I set the phone down on the counter and walked into my bedroom. The suitcase sat there now, fully packed, the zipper closed. I touched the handle like it was proof. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself remember something I usually pushed away. I remembered being 16 at my aunt's house during Thanksgiving when the adults decided to go for a walk after dinner. I had been halfway through a slice of pie when my mother leaned down and said so sweetly, "You will stay with the little ones, you are so mature." Everyone had laughed, the good kind of laugh, the one that sounded like approval. I remember the way my cheeks warmed, pride mixed with something else I could not name yet. That walk lasted 2 hours. I spent it cleaning sticky hands, breaking up fights over toys, bouncing a toddler on my hip, while my cousin cried because she missed her mother. When the adults came back, rosy and relaxed, my mother kissed my cheek and said, "See, you are such a blessing. I do not know what I would do without you." I carried that sentence like a badge for years. But what kind of badge comes with a chain attached? I remembered another Christmas years later when I was in my early 20s, and I had planned to meet friends for dinner the week before the holiday. I was excited. I had bought a new sweater. I had actually felt like my own person for once. An hour before I was supposed to leave, my mother called and said, "Your brother has an emergency, you need to pick up the kids." I asked what the emergency was, and she said in that impatient tone, "It does not matter. Families help each other." I did it. Of course I did. I sat on my brother's couch with two kids who did not want to go to bed, watching the clock creep past the time my friends would have been ordering dessert. I texted them an excuse, something vague, something polite. When my brother came home, he smelled like beer. He grinned and said, "Thanks, you are the best." I told myself it was fine because they needed me. The truth was, they needed me because I made it easy to need me. I went back to the kitchen and picked up my phone again. My mother had sent another message overnight, a long one full of little details that made my jaw clench. "Make sure you bring the kids their pajamas, and please be here early, because I will need you to keep them upstairs while we set up downstairs, and I bought special outfits for pictures, so keep them clean, and do not let them have juice before photos, and I will leave the schedule on the counter." She had written it like a manager leaving instructions for an employee. No please, no thank you, no question, just assignment. I could feel my hands trembling, so I set the phone down again and forced myself to eat a piece of toast. The kitchen smelled like coffee and winter air, and I chewed slowly as if taking my time was an act of rebellion. Around noon, my phone rang. My mother's name flashed on the screen, and for a second my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders tightened, my throat closed up, and that familiar voice inside me said, "Answer, fix it." I did not answer. I watched it ring until it stopped. Then I watched the voicemail notification appear like a little red dot of pressure. A minute later, a text came through. "Call me when you get a chance. Honey, we need to finalize plans. I just want everything to be perfect." Perfect. That word was another weapon in my family, a pretty one. Perfect meant control. Perfect meant everything arranged exactly how my mother wanted it, with no surprises, no discomfort, no mess she could not manage. And in her version of perfect, I was always in the background, making sure the kids were quiet, making sure the adults could relax, making sure my mother could play hostess without breaking a sweat. I thought about the cabin again, the quiet I had paid for the time I had earned. Then I thought about my mother's living room, the sound of 5 kids, the constant need, the way my name would be called every 2 minutes like a bell. "Lauren, she needs water. Lauren, he is crying. Lauren, can you change her? Lauren, can you keep them busy? Lauren, can you take them upstairs? Lauren, can you?" My life reduced to a list of tasks. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from Tessa. "Hey girl, I heard you are taking the kids for a couple days. You are an angel. I owe you. I will drop them off with snacks." I stared at that and felt something go very cold inside me. Heard. That meant my mother was talking. Not asking, not checking, talking. She was spreading it, building certainty around my compliance, so that when I finally tried to say no, I would look like the selfish one disrupting everyone's plans. It was manipulation dressed up as holiday cheer. I could feel anger rising, but underneath it was a strange sadness. Not because I wanted to babysit, because I realized how little my family actually knew me. They knew my role. They knew my usefulness. They did not know my dreams, my deadlines, the way I had been quietly building something for myself, with the kind of discipline they praised in theory but punished in practice. That afternoon, Dina stopped by again, not with dinner this time, just with the kind of steady presence that made me feel less crazy. She walked in, saw my face, and said, "It's worse, isn't it?" I held up my phone. "They're acting like it's done," I said, like I already agreed. Dina read the messages, her eyebrows lifting higher with each one. She shook her head slowly. "They are not even pretending to ask," she said. "They are just planning around you like you are furniture." That word hit hard, and I hated how accurate it was. I sank onto my couch phone in my lap and rubbed my forehead. Part of me wants to send a big message right now and blow it up, I admitted. But if I do, she will start calling everyone and she will twist it, and I will end up defending myself for weeks. Dina sat beside me close enough that her shoulder warmed mine. "That is the point," she said. "She wants you exhausted. She wants you explaining. She wants you to feel like you have to prove you are not a bad daughter." I looked at Dina, my eyes burning. "What if I am?" I whispered. "What if I really am selfish this time?" Dina's voice softened. "Lauren being selfish would be dumping 5 kids on someone without asking," she said. "Being selfish would be planning a whole holiday on somebody else's back and calling it love." I swallowed. My throat felt tight. Then Dina said, "If you keep saving them, they will never learn. And you will never stop losing." I nodded slowly, not because it felt good, but because it felt true. After Dina left, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my notebook beside it. I wrote down the phrases my family used on repeat, like I was studying a pattern I had finally decided to break. "You're flexible. You don't have real responsibilities. Families help each other. Don't be dramatic. You always come through." Then I wrote down what those phrases really meant. "Your time is ours. Your life is less important. Your feelings are inconvenient. Your no is unacceptable." Seeing it on paper made my hands shake again. It also made something inside me steady. That evening, my brother called. I watched his name flash on the screen and I felt that old reflex again, the urge to answer to keep peace. But I was tired of peace that only existed when I gave up pieces of myself. I let it go to voicemail. His message came in a minute later. His voice sounded irritated, like I had already inconvenienced him by not picking up. "Hey Lauren, we need to know your exact arrival time Christmas Eve. Mom said you are handling the kids, so just text me when you can, okay?" Handling. Like I was a hired help. I stared at the voicemail screen and I could feel the line inside me hardening, not into hatred, into something cleaner, a boundary. And the strangest part was, even with all that pressure pressing down, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. Because for the first time I could see the shape of the trap clearly. I could see the invisible contract. I could see the way my mother used my silence as consent, and my love as leverage, and my fear as a leash. I stood up, walked to my bedroom, and opened my suitcase just to make sure it was all still there, like someone might have come in and undone my decision while I wasn't looking. Everything was packed. Boot, sweater, book, the little pouch of toiletries, my reservation printed and tucked in the side pocket. My keys lay on the dresser. My world, my own. I closed the suitcase again and sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees. I did not send a dramatic group chat message. I did not call my mother to argue. I did not try to defend myself against a story that had already been written without me. Instead, I made another list, shorter this time, sharper. What I would do. What I would not do. I will not negotiate my autonomy. I will not explain my life to people who dismiss it. I will not rescue adults from choices they made on purpose. I stared at those sentences until my breathing slowed. Outside, the sky had gone dark, and a few early Christmas lights blinked in windows across the parking lot, soft and cheerful, like nothing was wrong in the world. My phone buzzed once more, a message from my mother. Tomorrow, we are doing a quick run-through at the house. I need you there to go over the kids' schedule. Do not be late. I read it twice, then set the phone down gently like I was placing something fragile aside. My heart thudded steady and heavy, and I realized something that scared me even more than my mother's anger. They had already built their perfect holiday around a lie, and I was the only one who could keep it standing. I turned off the bedside lamp, lay back on my pillow, and stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the quiet of my own apartment. For years, I had confused being needed with being loved. That night, as my family's expectations tightened around me, I finally understood the difference, and I knew the next move I made would change everything, not just Christmas, but the way they saw me forever. By the third day after my mother's message about the schedule, the words themselves started to lose their power over me. They still arrived with the same weight, the same expectation, but something in the way they landed had changed. It was like hearing a song you had loved for years, and suddenly noticing the lyrics for the first time, realizing how unsettling they actually were. My phone kept lighting up, not with questions, but with instructions. Bring the kids' pajamas. Make sure they nap. Be here early. Don't let them have sugar. Every message assumed my agreement, my availability, my silence. And the strangest part was how familiar it all felt. This wasn't new pressure. It was old pressure wearing a holiday sweater. I noticed how my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders didn't tense the way they usually did. My stomach didn't twist itself into knots. Instead, there was a flatness, a quiet space where guilt normally rushed in. I wasn't numb. I was awake. I started paying attention to the language my family used, really listening instead of translating it into something kinder. When my mother said, "I just need you," she meant, "I don't want to deal with this myself." When my brother said, "You're so good with the kids," he meant, "I don't want to be." When Tessa said, "You're an angel," she meant, "Thank you for taking this off my plate." None of it was malicious in the way movies portray villains. It was casual, comfortable, the kind of entitlement that grows in a family where one person has always said yes. That realization opened a door I had kept shut for a long time, and once it was open, memories started pouring through whether I wanted them to or not. I thought about the summer I turned 18 when my parents hosted a barbecue and invited half the extended family. I had just gotten my first part-time job and was scheduled to work that afternoon. I remember telling my mother weeks in advance, reminding her again the morning of feeling proud that I had a responsibility that wasn't hers. When the guests arrived early and the kids started running wild, my mother pulled me aside and said, "Just call in sick, they need you more than some silly job." I remember hesitating, the phone heavy in my hand, my manager's voice already in my head. I remember my mother's smile tightening when I didn't move fast enough. "Don't make this difficult," she said. "Family comes first." I called in sick. Later that night, when everyone had left and the house was finally quiet, my mother hugged me and said, "I don't know what I would do without you. You're so mature for your age." That word again. Mature. It always came when I gave something up. At the time, I thought maturity meant sacrifice. I didn't realize it also meant learning not to ask for anything back. Another memory surfaced sharper this time. I was in my early 20s dating someone seriously for the first time. We had planned a weekend away. Nothing fancy, just a drive to the coast and a cheap hotel. I told my mother about it, excited, hopeful. She listened, nodded, and then 2 days before we were supposed to leave, she called and said, "Your cousin's babysitter fell through. You can't leave them stranded." I said I had plans. She sighed and said, "I thought you were more responsible than that. I canceled the trip." My boyfriend tried to be understanding, but something shifted between us after that. A crack I didn't know how to explain. He didn't say it, but I could feel the question in the air. Why did you let them do that to you? I asked myself that question years later, sitting alone in my apartment, staring at my phone as it buzzed with messages about Christmas logistics. Why did I let them do that to me? The answer was uncomfortable. Because it worked. It kept the peace. It kept me needed. It kept me in the role everyone understood. The reliable one. The backup plan. The person who would always step in when someone else stepped out. I started to see the unspoken contract I had signed without ever reading. I would adapt. I would adjust. I would be flexible. In return, I would be praised, thanked, and occasionally made to feel indispensable. But the moment I asked for the same consideration, the moment I wanted something that didn't fit their plans, the contract turned against me. Breaking it felt dangerous because I had been taught that love was conditional. That afternoon, I sat at my dining table with my notebook open, not writing lists this time, just staring at a single question I had scrawled across the page. When did I stop being asked? I didn't have to think long. It happened gradually the way erosion works. At first, there were requests, then assumptions, then expectations. Somewhere along the line, my consent stopped mattering because my compliance was guaranteed. My family didn't see themselves as taking advantage of me because I had never made them uncomfortable enough to question it. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. The praise always came after I gave something up. My time, my plans, my rest. And the praise never came when I protected myself. In those moments, there was disappointment, confusion, sometimes anger. I realized something else too, something that stung more than I expected. I was never praised for building a life of my own. When I got a promotion, my mother said, "That's nice, but don't let it make you too busy for family." When I moved into my own place, she worried out loud about me being lonely. When I talked about traveling, she reminded me how expensive and impractical it was. Anything that pulled me further into myself, further into independence, was treated like a phase or a problem to be managed. But when I stayed home, when I canceled plans, when I made myself smaller, the praise flowed easily. I closed my notebook and leaned back in my chair, the weight of that truth settling in my chest. I wasn't just the family helper. I was the pressure valve. The person who absorbed stress so others didn't have to. And my mother wasn't the only one who relied on that. My brother benefited the most, and it took me years to admit it. He had a family, a busy job, a social life that stayed intact, because mine didn't. When something came up, he didn't have to scramble. He didn't have to negotiate with his wife or rearrange his schedule. He just called Mom, and Mom called me. I scrolled back through our text history, noticing the pattern with fresh eyes. His messages were always short, casual, confident. "Can you grab the kids? We need help tonight. Mom said you're free." He never asked if I was okay with it. He never apologized. He assumed. And I let him. Seeing that didn't make me hate him. It made me sad. Sad for the version of myself who had thought being easy to use was the same as being loved. That evening, as if on cue, my brother texted again. "Just checking you'll be there early tomorrow. Mom wants to do a run-through with you." With you. Like we were a team. I stared at the message and felt the old instinct surge, the urge to reply quickly to reassure him, to keep everything smooth. Instead, I put the phone down and walked to the window. The sky was dark, the air outside sharp with cold. Somewhere down the street, a family was stringing lights, laughter drifting faintly through the air. I wondered what it would feel like to experience a holiday without managing anyone else's emotions. A memory surfaced that made my throat tighten. A photo my mother loved to post every year, the one of the family gathered around the tree. Everyone smiling, kids in the center, adults leaning in. I was always there too, technically. But if you looked closely, I was usually standing slightly apart. A child on my hip, my attention angled away from the camera. Proof I was present but not participating. I had told myself that was fine, that my joy came from making sure everyone else was happy. But what if that was a lie I had learned to tell myself because the truth was harder? The truth was that I had been slowly disappearing in my own family, becoming useful instead of visible. Later that night, my mother finally left a voicemail. I listened to it once, then again, just to be sure I wasn't imagining the tone. "Lauren," she said, her voice tight, "I need to know what's going on with you. Everyone is counting on you. I don't understand why you're being so distant. This isn't like you." That last line lingered. This isn't like you. She was right. It wasn't. Because the version of me she was used to didn't question, didn't hesitate, didn't make her uncomfortable. That version of me existed to make her life easier. I sat on my couch with the phone in my hand and thought about the cost of staying that person. Not just this Christmas, but every holiday after, every weekend emergency, every unspoken expectation. I thought about the future version of myself, older, maybe sitting alone one day, wondering where the years had gone, realizing I had spent them smoothing over other people's lives instead of building my own. The fear that rose up then wasn't about my mother's reaction or my brother's disappointment. It was about regret. I knew something else now, something that felt both heavy and freeing. This pattern would not break on its own. It relied on me staying the same, on me believing that my worth was tied to how much I gave up, on me being afraid of what would happen if I stepped out of line. I picked up my notebook again and wrote one more sentence slower this time, pressing the pen into the page. If nothing changes, nothing changes. It sounded obvious, almost too simple, but for me, it felt revolutionary. I didn't send any messages that night. I didn't call my mother back. I let the silence sit, even though it made my skin itch. I went through my evening routine like I always did, washing dishes, folding laundry, brushing my teeth. Ordinary actions that felt strangely grounding. When I lay down in bed, the ceiling looked different, less like a weight pressing down on me, and more like open space. I thought about the unspoken contract again, about how terrified I had been of breaking it, because I thought it would mean losing my family. What I was starting to understand was that I had already lost myself trying to keep it. As sleep crept in, I felt a steady resolve settle into place. I didn't know exactly how the next few days would unfold. I didn't know how loud the fallout would be, or who would be angry, or how long the tension would last. But I knew one thing with a clarity that surprised me. This Christmas was not an exception. It was the turning point. And once you see the pattern clearly, you can never pretend you don't see it again. The next morning, I went back to work like nothing was happening, and that alone felt strange. For years, whenever family pressure ramped up, everything else in my life shrank to make room for it. Work became something I rushed through. Meals became something I skipped. Sleep became shallow and restless. This time, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and did my job. I answered emails. I reviewed timelines. I joined meetings and spoke when it was my turn. My coworkers saw the same Lauren they always did, steady, organized, reliable. None of them knew that my family was quietly rearranging my Christmas around me without asking. None of them knew how close I was to detonating a role I had played my entire adult life. That contrast followed me all day. At work, my time was respected. Meetings were scheduled. Deadlines were discussed. If someone needed something from me, they asked. If I said no, it meant no. There was no guilt, no emotional fallout, no implication that I was a bad person for protecting my bandwidth. At home, my family treated my time like a shared resource. I had learned somewhere along the way to keep those two worlds separate. Not because I was ashamed of my family, but because I had learned what happened when I let them see too much of my independence. They minimized it. They worried it. They tried to manage it back into something smaller. So I stopped telling them things. That afternoon, during a lull between meetings, I opened a folder on my computer that I rarely opened when anyone else was around. Inside were documents, notes, schedules, and emails tied to the plan I had been quietly working toward for months. The one thing my family did not know about. It wasn't a vacation. Not really. It was a professional certification program I had been accepted into, one that could change the trajectory of my career. It required uninterrupted focus, a set number of hours logged during a specific window, and a final evaluation scheduled right after the holidays. I had applied in secret, interviewed on my lunch breaks, studied late at night, when my phone was silent. When the acceptance email came through, I had stared at it for a long time before letting myself smile. It was the first thing in years that belonged entirely to me. The Christmas break wasn't time off. It was time in. Time I had carved out carefully, deliberately, knowing that if my family knew about it too early, they would see it as negotiable. Something I could pause, something I could reschedule. Something less important than 5 kids and a picture-perfect holiday. I had learned that lesson the hard way. Years earlier, I had told my mother about a night class I wanted to take, something small, but meaningful. She had listened, nodded, then said, "Well, that's nice, but make sure it doesn't interfere with family dinners." A week later, she scheduled something during my class time and acted surprised when I reminded her. "Oh, I didn't realize it was that important," she said. It was always important. It just wasn't important to her. So this time, I kept my mouth shut. I closed the folder and went back to my work, my pulse steady. The knowledge that I had something real at stake made the family messages feel different. Not just irritating, but dangerous. Babysitting wouldn't just be an inconvenience. It would sabotage something I had worked for quietly, carefully. Something that represented my future, not theirs. My phone buzzed again around mid-afternoon. A message from my mother. "Can you call me later? I want to go over a few details." Details. I pictured her kitchen table, papers spread out, lists written in her careful handwriting. She would want to walk me through nap schedules, snack preferences, bedtime routines. She would want to feel reassured that everything was under control. That I was under control. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I forwarded an email from the certification program to my personal account just in case. Then I saved copies of everything to a cloud folder with a neutral name, like I was protecting evidence. That thought made me pause. Evidence of what? Of a life I had been hiding because the people who claimed to love me treated my growth like an inconvenience. I left work on time that day, another small rebellion, and drove home with the radio off, letting my thoughts settle. The neighborhood looked the same as it always did. Bare trees, quiet streets, early Christmas lights flickering on as dusk fell. Everything looked normal. Inside me, things were shifting. At home, I kicked off my shoes and stood in the living room for a moment, taking in the quiet. No kids, no demands, no noise. Just the hum of the heater and the faint sound of a neighbor's television through the wall. I thought about how my family described me when I wasn't there. "Lauren will handle it. Lauren doesn't mind. Lauren is so good with them." They never said Lauren wants to. Or Lauren agreed. Or Lauren chose this. They never said Lauren has something else going on. Because they didn't ask. That evening, Dina called. I put her on speaker and moved around the kitchen chopping vegetables, the rhythm of it calming me. "Did you tell them yet?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not about any of it." Dina was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said finally. "You don't owe them an early warning about a boundary they never respected." I exhaled slowly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm lying by omission," I admitted. Dina snorted. "Lauren, she said they have been lying by assumption for years. You're just not correcting them anymore." I smiled despite myself. I told her about the certification, about the acceptance, about how much was riding on those days around Christmas. Dina listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she let out a low whistle. "That's huge," she said. "That's not optional babysitting territory. That's future you territory." "Exactly," I said, and my voice shook just a little. Then Dina asked the question I had been avoiding. "Why didn't you tell your mom?" I leaned against the counter and stared at the floor. "Because she would have made it about her," I said. "She would have worried or minimized it or asked why it couldn't wait. And then, when Christmas came up, she would have said, well, family is more important." Dina hummed softly. "So you learned to protect your dreams by keeping them private." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I didn't realize that was a boundary until now," I said. "It is," Dina replied. "And it's a smart one." After we hung up, I made dinner and ate it at the table, something I rarely did. I usually ate on the couch, phone in hand, half paying attention. This time, I sat upright, chewing, slowly listening to the quiet. My phone buzzed again. "Mom." I stared at it, then let it go to voicemail. Her message came through seconds later. "Lauren, please call me back. I'm starting to feel like you're avoiding me and I don't understand why. We need to talk about Christmas." Avoiding. As if talking was the same thing as complying. I sat there for a long time after that, my food growing cold, my thoughts steady, but heavy. I wasn't avoiding her. I was choosing not to be pulled into a conversation designed to corner me before I was ready. Silence, I was learning, was not the same as surrender. The next day, the pressure ramped up. My brother sent a message asking about drop-off times. Tessa asked what snacks she should pack. My father sent a photo of the guest room with a note about how it would be ready for me. My mother sent another long message about schedules. Each one assumed my presence. Each one tightened the knot. But each one also confirmed something important. They had already committed to the version of the story where I showed up. They were building everything on that assumption. And the longer I stayed quiet, the deeper they dug themselves in. That realization scared me, but it also clarified things. If I spoke too soon, I would give them time to pivot, to pressure, to rearrange the narrative so that I became the problem before the problem ever reached them. If I waited, if I let their certainty harden, the truth would land with weight they couldn't ignore. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was trying to stop saving them from themselves. That afternoon, during a break, I opened my calendar and blocked out the certification hours in bold, immovable chunks. I added notes. I set reminders. I treated my time the way my job treated it. Non-negotiable. I felt a strange mix of fear and pride as I did it. Fear of the fallout. Pride that I was finally taking myself seriously. That night, as I got ready for bed, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from my mother, shorter this time. "Please don't do this, Lauren. I don't know what's gotten into you." I read it once, then again. "Please don't do this." As if I was acting out, not stepping back. As if my silence was a betrayal, not a pause. I didn't respond. I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool, the room dark. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my heart beating steadily. For years, my family had filled every gap in my life with their needs, their plans, their emergencies. They had never noticed how carefully I had learned to make myself smaller to accommodate them. Now, for the first time, I was protecting something that mattered more than their comfort. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that when these two worlds finally collided, something was going to give. The only question was, who would be standing when it did? It happened the way it always did, quietly, at first disguised as good news. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed on the coffee table, the vibration sharp against the stillness of my apartment. I glanced at the screen without thinking, expecting another schedule update or reminder from my mother. Instead, it was a message in the family group chat sent with the kind of cheerful confidence that made my stomach drop before my mind caught up. "Okay, everyone," my mother wrote, "we are all set for Christmas. Lauren will be taking the kids so the rest of us can focus on hosting and getting everything ready. I cannot tell you how grateful I am. This is going to be perfect. Perfect. My hands stilled on a half-folded sweater. For a moment, the words didn't register as anger. They registered as disbelief, like I was reading a line from a script I hadn't been given, but was expected to perform anyway. She hadn't asked. She hadn't even waited. She had decided. Replies started pouring in almost immediately. Amazing, my brother wrote. This takes so much pressure off. You're a lifesaver, Tessa added. I was stressing about how we were going to manage. My father sent a thumbs-up emoji and a comment about how nice it would be to relax for once. Relax. I stared at the screen as the familiar feeling washed over me, that sense of being talked about instead of talked to. It wasn't even that they were thanking me. It was the certainty behind it. The way my role had been finalized, announced, locked in, like a reservation made without my name on it, but entirely dependent on me showing up. My phone buzzed again. A private message from my mother. I told everyone you would do it, she wrote. I knew once you had time to think you would come around. We really need you, Lauren. There it was laid bare. She hadn't just assumed. She had spoken for me. I sat down slowly on the couch, the folded laundry forgotten beside me. My heart was pounding, but my thoughts were oddly clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't crossed wires or poor communication. This was a choice she had made, counting on the fact that I would be too polite, too afraid, too conditioned to embarrass her by correcting it. I scrolled back through the group chat, rereading the messages with fresh eyes. No one questioned her. No one said, "Did you ask Lauren?" No one paused. They all moved forward, relieved, already enjoying the benefit of a sacrifice I had not agreed to make. My phone rang. My mother. I let it ring. It rang again. I turned the phone face down on the table and pressed my palms into my thighs, grounding myself. I could already hear how the call would go. She would start sweet, then confused, then frustrated. She would remind me how hard this was for her. She would say everyone was counting on me. She would say I was making things difficult. She would say, family doesn't do this to each other. The guilt tried to rise, but it hit something solid this time. Anger. Not explosive anger. Not shouting anger. The kind of anger that comes from finally seeing the full shape of something you have been living inside for years. I picked the phone back up and opened my messages to my brother instead. I stared at the blank text field, my fingers hovering. I could explain. I could soften it. I could say there had been a misunderstanding, that Mom had jumped the gun, that I was sorry for the confusion. I typed out 3 different versions of that message and deleted all of them. Every explanation put me in the position of justifying myself for a decision I had not even been allowed to make. Every apology made it easier for them to keep pretending this was about logistics instead of entitlement. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Tessa. Hey, just checking, what time should I drop the kids off Christmas Eve? I want to plan our drive. Plan our drive. They were already organizing their lives around my absence from my own. Something inside me went very still. I wrote back a single sentence. I am still figuring out my schedule. I will let you know. I stared at it before sending, knowing exactly how it would be interpreted. As a yes in progress, as reassurance, as proof that everything was under control. I hit send anyway. Not because I was agreeing, because I was watching. The relief was immediate. Tessa replied with a thumbs up and a thank you. My brother followed with a quick great. My mother sent a heart and a message about how proud she was of me. Proud. The word felt hollow now. I stood up and paced the length of my living room, my thoughts racing faster than my feet. This was the moment where the old version of me would have caved, would have stepped in to correct things, gently would have tried to salvage everyone's feelings before they even had time to bruise. This time I saw what that would cost. Correcting it now would turn me into the problem. It would give my mother space to cry to relatives about how I backed out at the last minute. It would let her reframe the story before reality had a chance to speak for itself. And worse, it would erase the lie. If I showed up, if I took the kids, if I played my part, no one would ever have to face what she had done. They would get their perfect holiday, and I would get another year of being the invisible glue holding everything together. I thought about the certification program, the hours blocked off on my calendar, the work waiting for me that had nothing to do with children's nap schedules or snack preferences. I thought about the future I was quietly building and how easily it could be pushed aside if I let this stand. My phone rang again. My mother. This time I answered. Her voice came through bright but tight, like she was already bracing herself. "Lauren, honey, I'm glad you picked up. I just wanted to make sure you saw the messages. Everyone is so relieved." "Relieved," I said, keeping my voice even. "Yes," she said quickly. "This takes such a load off. You have no idea how stressed I've been. I don't know what we would do without you." There it was again. The emotional hook she had used my whole life. "Mom," I said. Choosing each word carefully, I never said I would watch the kids. There was a pause, short but sharp. "Well, you didn't say you wouldn't," she replied. "And you know how these things go. We had to plan. Everyone else already arranged their schedules." "You arranged their schedules," I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. "You told everyone I would do it," I said instead. Her tone shifted, the sweetness thinning. "I knew you would," she said. "You always do. Don't make this into something bigger than it is." Something bigger. 5 kids. Several days. My time. My plans. My future. "Mom," I said, "I told you I had other things going on." She sighed, long and dramatic. "Lauren, everyone has things going on. But family comes first. You don't have kids, you don't have a spouse. This is easier for you than it is for the rest of us." Easier. The word landed like a door slamming shut. I felt the urge to argue, to list everything she didn't see: my work, my commitments, the effort it took to build a life on my own. Instead, I realized something else. She wasn't listening. She wasn't asking. She was instructing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I said the one thing that made her pause. "You shouldn't have told people I agreed to something I didn't agree to." Silence crackled on the line. Finally, she spoke, her voice cooler now. "So what are you saying, Lauren? Are you backing out?" Backing out. As if I had ever stepped in. "I'm saying," I replied, "that I never said yes." She exhaled sharply. "This is really unfair," she said. "You're putting me in a terrible position." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the pattern was so clear. Her discomfort was always more urgent than my autonomy. I ended the call soon after, telling her I needed time to think, the same phrase she had dismissed when it came from me. When the call ended, my phone immediately lit up with messages. My brother. "What's going on?" "Mom sounds upset." "Tessa. Is everything okay?" "Mom said you might be changing your mind." Changing my mind. Again, the narrative shifted to make me the unstable variable. I sat down at the kitchen table, my phone in front of me, and took a deep breath. The house felt too quiet, like it was waiting. I typed a message into the group chat, then erased it. Typed another. Erased that too. I didn't want to defend myself. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to negotiate. I wanted the truth to exist without me having to polish it. So instead of a speech, I sent a single sentence. "I never agreed to babysit. I told Mom I had other plans and needed time to think. I will let you all know what I decide." The typing indicators flickered, then stopped. For a long moment, no one replied. Then my brother wrote, "Wait, what do you mean you never agreed? Mom told us you promised." There it was. The lie out in the open, wobbling on its own legs. Tessa followed. "She said you were taking them. We already planned around that." My chest tightened, but I didn't back down. I wrote back calmly. I never promised anything. I'm sorry if there was confusion, but I didn't consent to being volunteered. The word consent felt heavy formal, but it was accurate. The chat went quiet again. Then my mother sent a private message longer than any before. I cannot believe you are doing this to me. You are embarrassing me. Everyone is going to think I can't manage my own family. Why would you put me in this position right before Christmas? I read it slowly. Not once did she ask if I was okay. Not once did she acknowledge what she had done. I didn't respond. I set my phone down and stood up, my legs shaky but steady enough to hold me. I walked into my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, my packed suitcase in the corner like a silent witness. My heart was racing now, not with panic, but with the awareness that something irreversible had happened. I had cracked the surface of a story that had been written without me for years. There would be fallout. I knew that. Anger, disappointment, accusations. Maybe silence. But there was something else too. Something I hadn't felt before. Relief. For the first time, the assumption wasn't working automatically. For the first time, my family had to confront the fact that I was not a service they could schedule without permission. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, my breath slowing as the noise in my head settled into a low hum. They had decided for me, and now they were about to learn what happens when the person you build everything on finally steps out of place. The next move would belong to me. The silence after that message felt heavier than any argument. It stretched through the apartment, through the evening, through the part of my mind that used to scramble to fix things before they broke. I didn't move right away. I didn't reach for my phone. I let the quiet exist, even though every instinct in me said this was dangerous territory. My phone buzzed again, then again, then again, each vibration a small demand for attention. I didn't check who it was. I knew. My mother would be pacing. My brother would be frustrated. Tessa would be confused and irritated. They were all circling the same problem, and for once I wasn't rushing in to solve it. I made myself dinner, something simple, standing at the counter while the pan hissed softly. The smell of garlic filled the kitchen, grounding me in the present. I ate slowly, deliberately, like someone reclaiming a habit they had abandoned. With each bite, I felt more solid, less pulled apart by other people's urgency. After dinner, I finally picked up my phone. There were 14 missed calls. 8 from my mother, 3 from my brother, 2 from my father, 1 from Tessa. The group chat was a blur of messages I didn't read yet. I scrolled past them and opened the last voicemail from my mother instead, bracing myself. Her voice was tight and breathless, the way it always got when she felt her grip slipping. Lauren, I don't understand why you're doing this. Everyone is upset. You're creating so much unnecessary stress. I raised you better than this. Call me back right now. Raised you better than this. I sat on the couch and let that line echo. It was one of her favorites, deployed whenever I stepped outside the version of me she approved of. It framed obedience as character and resistance as failure. I deleted the voicemail. Then I opened the group chat. The tone had shifted from confusion to irritation. My brother had written that he couldn't believe Mom was dealing with this right now. Tessa said she wished I had been clearer sooner. My father tried to smooth things over, saying everyone just needed to calm down. No one asked me what I wanted. No one acknowledged that the plan had been made without my consent. The discomfort was being redirected, passed around anything to avoid naming the real issue. I typed slowly, choosing each word with care. I was clear with Mom that I had other plans and never agreed to babysit. I understand this is stressful, but I can't be responsible for a plan I didn't consent to. I hit send and set the phone down again. This time, the silence that followed felt different. It wasn't empty. It was charged. A few minutes later, my brother replied privately, "This is really screwing things up, Lauren. You know Mom can't handle all those kids by herself." I read it twice, noticing how quickly responsibility had shifted back to me. Not the person who volunteered someone else's time, not the adults who made plans based on assumptions. Me, I wrote back. That's exactly the problem. Everyone assumes I will handle it so no one else has to. There was a pause before he responded. So what, you're just not coming at all now? Not coming. The implication hung there. That my presence was only valuable if it came with childcare attached. I didn't answer him right away. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark parking lot below. A few cars pulled in and out, people living their ordinary lives, unaware that my family was unraveling over an expectation I had finally refused to meet. When I did reply, my message was short. I'm still coming for Christmas dinner. I'm not babysitting. Another pause. Then he wrote, "That doesn't help." I stared at those words and felt something inside me settle. It doesn't help. Not them. Not their plans. Not their convenience. But it helped me. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not perfectly, but deeply enough to dream. In the morning, I woke with the familiar weight in my chest, but it wasn't dread. It was anticipation. The fallout was coming. The next day, the pressure escalated. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced, something she rarely did, and the knock on my door was sharp, impatient. I stood on the other side for a moment, my hand on the handle, reminding myself that I was allowed to open the door without surrendering. When I did, she stepped inside without waiting to be invited, her coat still on her face, tight with controlled fury. "What is going on with you?" she demanded, pacing into my living room. "You're acting like a stranger." I closed the door behind her slowly. "I'm not acting like anything I said. I'm setting a boundary." She laughed, short and humorless. "A boundary?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Since when do you talk like that? This is family. We don't put up walls with family. We also don't volunteer each other without asking," I said. She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes flashing. "I did what I had to do," she said. "Someone needed to watch the kids. Everyone else already had plans." "So you made me the plan?" I replied. Her mouth tightened. "You're the most capable," she said. "You always have been. I thought you would understand." Understand. I felt the familiar tug of that word, the way it had been used to mean accept, absorb, comply. Understanding doesn't mean agreeing, I said. And being capable doesn't mean being obligated. She stared at me like I had spoken in another language. "You're being selfish," she said finally. "You're thinking only about yourself." I took a breath, steady and slow. "For the first time, I am thinking about myself," I corrected. "That's different." Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened again. "After everything I've done for you," she said quietly. There it was. The ledger. The invisible balance sheet where my compliance was repayment for love. I didn't raise my voice. "I am grateful for what you've done for me," I said. "But that doesn't mean you get to decide how I spend my time now." She shook her head, her frustration spilling over. "You don't have kids. You don't know how hard this is." I met her gaze. "You're right," I said. "I don't have kids. That doesn't mean my life is empty space you can fill whenever you want." The words hung between us, raw and undeniable. She looked away first. "I can't believe you would do this right before Christmas," she said. "You're ruining it." I didn't answer that. I knew better now than to argue with a story she needed to tell herself. She left shortly after, slamming the door behind her, and the sound echoed through the apartment like punctuation. I sat down on the couch and let the adrenaline drain out of me. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. The confrontation hadn't fixed anything, but it had done something else. It had exposed the truth. That evening, the messages kept coming, but their tone changed. Less anger, more urgency. My brother asked if I could at least take the kids for a few hours. Tessa asked if we could compromise. My father suggested we all talk it out. Compromise. I considered it for a moment, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to be sure. If I took the kids for a few hours, what would change? Nothing. The assumption would remain. The next holiday, the next emergency, the next convenient sacrifice would land on me again. I would have taught them that all it took was enough pressure. So I said no. Calmly. Clearly. Repeatedly. No, I can't do that. No, that doesn't work for me. No, I already said I'm not babysitting. Each no felt steadier than the last. By the end of the night, the messages slowed. The group chat went quiet. My phone stopped buzzing. I sat in the stillness, exhausted but oddly peaceful. For the first time, I could feel the shape of my own life without my family's expectations draped over it. It was unfamiliar, a little lonely, but also lighter. I packed my bag for the next day, folded clothes with care, and placed my notebook on top. The one where I had written my boundaries, my plans, my quiet rebellion. As I turned off the light and climbed into bed, a thought surfaced that surprised me with its simplicity. They were learning. Not because I explained myself perfectly. Not because I convinced them. But because I stopped filling the gap they had come to rely on. The consequences were starting to shift away from me. And tomorrow, when the real chaos began to unfold, I knew I would finally see just how much weight I had been carrying all along. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a clarity that almost felt unreal. I woke up before my alarm, the room still dim, the city quiet in that rare pause before the day begins demanding things. For a moment, I lay there listening to my own breathing, waiting for the familiar rush of anxiety to hit. It didn't. What I felt instead was a steady awareness, like standing on solid ground after years of shifting sand. My phone was on the nightstand, face down. I didn't reach for it right away. I stretched, sat up, and let my feet touch the floor, grounding myself in the fact that I was still here, still in my own space, still in control of my morning. When I finally checked my phone, the notifications were already stacked. Missed calls, messages. The group chat icon glowed like a warning light. I scrolled through without opening anything, just enough to confirm what I already knew. They were scrambling. I showered slowly, letting the water run hot over my shoulders, washing away the last residue of guilt that tried to cling to me. I got dressed with intention, comfortable clothes, hair pulled back, no rush. I made coffee and stood at the counter, sipping it, looking out at the pale winter sky. Somewhere across town, my mother's house was filling up with noise. Children arriving early, coats piled by the door, bags of snacks, expectations stacked high, and I wasn't there. My phone rang while I was pouring a second cup of coffee. My mother. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Her voice came through strained, already pitched high. "Where are you?" she asked, skipping any greeting. "At home," I said. "What do you mean at home?" she snapped. "The kids are here. Your brother just dropped them off. Tessa is on her way. You said you would let us know." I set my mug down carefully. "I did let you know," I said. "I told you I wasn't babysitting." "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking now. "You know how much I have to do today. I can't manage all of this and host at the same time." I could hear the background through the phone. A child crying. Another shouting. The clatter of something being dropped. "You shouldn't have planned around me without my consent," I said quietly. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "I told everyone you agreed," she said. "I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," I replied. "You just chose the one that didn't involve asking me." She started talking faster, words tumbling over each other. "Your brother and sister already made reservations. The kids are excited. Everyone is expecting you. This is not the time to make a point." This wasn't about making a point. This was about reality finally catching up. "I'm not coming over to watch the kids," I said again. "I'll see everyone at dinner." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost pleading. "You're putting me in an impossible position." I closed my eyes for a moment. "You put yourself there," I said. "You just aren't used to feeling it." She hung up without another word. I stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand, my heart beating steadily. The call hadn't rattled me the way it used to. The panic, the urge to fix, to apologize, to rush over and take control, didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange distance, like watching a storm from behind glass. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from my brother. "Mom says you're not coming." "Are you serious right now?" I typed back. "I'm serious. I'll be there for dinner. I'm not babysitting." He replied almost immediately. "This is unbelievable. She's losing it over there." I stared at the words. Losing it. Because for once there was no safety net. I didn't respond. Instead, I picked up my bag and headed out the door. I had a few errands to run before settling in for the day. Things for myself. A walk. A quiet lunch. Time. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, waking me up fully. The city moved around me, people bundled in coats carrying gifts, rushing toward obligations I was stepping away from. As I walked, my phone buzzed again and again. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I already knew the arc of what was happening: confusion, anger, panic, blame, and underneath it all, the realization that they would have to handle it themselves. By late morning, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the group chat. The messages were frantic now. "Where is Lauren?" "Mom, I thought you said she agreed. I dropped the kids off already. How are we supposed to manage this? You said she would be here." The tone had shifted. The certainty was gone, replaced by accusation. My mother finally replied in the group chat. She changed her mind at the last minute. "I don't know what's gotten into her." There it was. The narrative pivot. I typed one message and sent it without overthinking. "I didn't change my mind, I never agreed. I told Mom weeks ago I had other plans." The chat went quiet. Then my sister wrote, "Wait, what do you mean you never agreed?" "I never said yes," I wrote. "I was told I would be doing it without being asked." A few seconds passed. Then my brother responded, "Mom told us you promised." I could almost feel the weight of that lie collapsing under its own contradictions. I put my phone away and kept walking. By the time I got home, it was early afternoon. I made myself lunch and ate it slowly, savoring the quiet. The stillness in my apartment felt like a luxury. My phone rang again. This time, it was a video call from my mother. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her face filled the screen, flushed and frantic. Behind her, the living room was chaos. Toys scattered everywhere. One child crying on the couch. Another running past the camera. The sound of cartoons blaring. "You have to come now," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't do this. They're everywhere. Your sister is late. Your brother left already. This isn't fair." I watched her for a moment, really watched her. This was the scene I had been absorbing for years, stepping into without hesitation, smoothing over, managing, making invisible. "I can't come," I said calmly. Her eyes widened. "You're really doing this?" she whispered. "You're choosing this over your family." "I chose myself," I replied. "For once." She shook her head, tears welling up. "I raised you to care," she said. "I do care," I said. "That's why I'm not pretending this is okay anymore." A loud crash sounded behind her, followed by a wail. She flinched, glancing off screen. "I have to go," she said, her voice tight. "I can't talk right now." She ended the call abruptly. I set my phone down and sat back, my heart pounding, not with guilt, but with the sheer intensity of it all. The consequences were unfolding exactly where they belonged. By late afternoon, the messages slowed. The frantic energy burned itself out, replaced by silence. I imagined my siblings taking turns watching the kids' dinner plans delayed or canceled, tempers fraying. Dinner came and went without me. I didn't check in. I didn't send apologies. I let the absence speak. That evening, as the sky darkened and Christmas lights flickered on around the neighborhood, my phone buzzed once more. A message from my sister. This was a mess. We didn't realize how much you usually handle. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I replied, neither did I. I turned my phone off and sat by the window watching the lights across the street glow softly against the night. For the first time in years, Christmas Eve belonged to me. And somewhere in the noise and frustration, I wasn't absorbing something fundamental was shifting. I went to bed that night with my apartment finally quiet again, the kind of quiet that used to feel lonely, but now felt like a soft blanket. I didn't sleep perfectly. I woke up a few times not because I regretted what I'd done, but because my mind kept replaying the sound of my mother's voice on that video call, the panic in it, the way she had always expected me to come running the moment her world got messy. Each time I woke, I reminded myself of the truth. The mess wasn't mine. I didn't create it. I just stopped absorbing it. By morning, Christmas Day, my phone was still off. I let myself lie there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heater. Outside, the sky was pale and cold, the city quieter than usual, like everyone was holding their breath in holiday stillness. My first impulse was to turn my phone back on, not because I missed them, because I knew there would be consequences, and part of me still felt responsible for knowing what they were. That part of me had been trained to monitor, to anticipate, to prevent. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, then reached for my phone and turned it on. It came alive immediately, lighting up with notifications, missed calls, voicemails, texts. The group chat icon glowed with a number so high it almost looked like a joke. I didn't open anything right away. I made coffee first, slow and deliberate. I toasted a bagel. I moved through my kitchen like I had all the time in the world, because for once I did. Then I sat at the table and opened the family group chat. The thread read like a slow-motion collapse. At first there were the frantic messages from yesterday, the ones I had only skimmed. People asking where I was. My mother insisting I had changed my mind. My siblings complaining that they had plans. My father trying to calm everyone down. Then the tone shifted. My brother had written late last night after the chaos had hit a peak. Mom, why did you tell us she promised when she didn't? Tessa had replied. Seriously, we already rearranged everything. You said she agreed weeks ago. My mother responded after a long pause. She did agree. She just decided to be dramatic at the last minute. I felt my jaw tighten. Not dramatic. Not a last-minute decision. Not a whim. A boundary. But my mother's instinct was the same as it always was: rewrite the story so she remained the victim, and I became the unpredictable villain. A few messages later, my sister wrote something that made me inhale sharply. Mom, I love you, but this isn't new. You always do this. You volunteer her and act like it's a done deal. There was a long stretch of silence after that. Then my mother sent a message that was all caps. I did what I had to do. Someone had to help. You all rely on me too. The irony was almost painful. She was furious at being relied on for one day while I had been relied on for years. I scrolled my fingers, steady my emotions shifting in quiet waves. Anger, yes, but also something else. Relief. Because for the first time my siblings were seeing her behavior clearly. Not because I convinced them. Because they felt the consequences of it. My phone rang. My mother. I stared at the screen and felt my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with the awareness that whatever happened next would shape the future. I answered. Her voice came through hoarse, tired, stripped of the sharp edge from yesterday. Merry Christmas, she said, and it sounded like the words hurt. Merry Christmas, I replied. There was a pause long enough that I could hear faint noise in the background, a child whining, someone moving dishes. I didn't sleep, my mother said quietly. I didn't either, I admitted. Another pause. Your father is furious, she said. I waited. I didn't fill the silence for her. Your brother and sister are furious too, she continued, her voice catching. They said I lied. They said I set them up. You did? I said gently. A small sound escaped her, almost like a laugh, but bitter. I didn't think you would actually do it, she said. I thought you would cave. You always cave. The truth in that sentence landed like a slap, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. She had built her entire plan on my pattern of giving in. I didn't respond right away. I let her hear the quiet. Finally, she spoke again, and her voice sounded smaller. It was a disaster, Lauren. The kids were everywhere. Your sister screamed at your brother. He left in the middle of dinner. We ended up eating leftovers. Someone spilled juice on the rug. Your father was trying to calm the twins down while I was on the phone with your aunt telling her you had abandoned us. My mouth went dry. You called Aunt Carol, I said. I had to. My mother snapped the edge, returning for a second. She asked why you weren't here. People talk. What was I supposed to say? The truth, I thought. You were supposed to say the truth. But I didn't say that. I stayed quiet. My mother's voice softened again. She said something, Lauren. Carol did. She said she doesn't understand why I expect you to do this every year. She said it's not your job. I blinked, surprised. Aunt Carol wasn't known for challenging my mother. She usually repeated whatever my mother said, wrapped in a smile and a prayer. What did you say? I asked. My mother took a shaky breath. I told her you're strong, she said. That you're reliable. That you don't have as much going on. That it's easier for you. There it was again, that phrase said out loud, exposed. And Carol said. My mother continued, her voice quieter now, that maybe I just assume it's easier because you don't complain. She said maybe you've been holding it in because you didn't want to be the bad one. A long silence filled the line. I stared down at my hands on the table, seeing them tremble slightly. Not from guilt. From the release of hearing someone else name it. My mother spoke again, and she sounded older than she had yesterday. I didn't realize how it sounded until she made me repeat it, she said. I didn't realize how ugly it sounded. I swallowed. It sounded ugly for a long time, Mom, I said. You just weren't the one hearing it. She didn't argue. That was new. I'm not calling to fight, she said finally. I'm calling because I feel like I lost something. Like I don't know how to do this without you. My chest tightened. That's the problem, I said quietly. You shouldn't have to do it with me as the solution every time. She exhaled, and I could hear the strain in it. Your father thinks you owe us an apology, she said. I felt my eyes narrow. For what I asked. For not agreeing to something I never agreed to. She hesitated. For the timing, she said. For making it blow up like this. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the pale winter light. You mean for letting the consequences hit you all at once, I said. Instead of me absorbing them quietly like I always have. There was silence again. Then my mother said very softly, I didn't know it felt like that to you. The words could have been comforting. Instead, they made me sad. Because I had tried to show her gently over and over. She hadn't wanted to see it. I didn't tell her about the certification program. I still wasn't ready. I didn't trust that she wouldn't try to turn it into another debate about priorities. Instead, I said the truth I could say, without exposing everything. It felt like I didn't matter unless I was useful, I said. My mother's breath hitched. That's not true, she whispered. But it has felt true, I replied. For years. She didn't deny it again. Her silence this time was different, weighted as if she was finally hearing something she couldn't unhear. After a moment, she said, I'm sorry Christmas was so hard. I could have corrected her. I could have said, I'm sorry you made it hard. I could have pressed. But I didn't want to win. I wanted change. I'm sorry it was hard too, I said. But I'm not sorry I wasn't there. Her voice tightened. You really mean that, don't you? Yes, I said. I really do. Another pause. We can't do this again, she said, and her voice sounded like she was talking to herself as much as to me. I can't go through that again. I almost laughed, but it came out as a soft breath. Neither can I said. We ended the call awkwardly, not with warmth, not with a resolution, but with a kind of exhausted truce. She said she needed to go. I said, okay. Neither of us said I love you, which would have felt like a bandage slapped over something still bleeding. Afterward, I sat there for a long time staring at my coffee as it cooled. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't gloating. I felt a quiet grief for the fact that it had taken this kind of collapse for my family to see what I had been carrying. My phone buzzed with a message from my brother. Dad is pissed. Mom is a mess. You could have handled this better. I stared at the message and the familiar urge to defend myself rose up. I started typing, then stopped. What would better have looked like to him? Better would have meant quieter. Better would have meant I gave in. Better would have meant he didn't have to feel uncomfortable. I wrote back. I handled it the only way I could. I said no, and I meant it. He didn't reply. A few minutes later, Tessa texted, I didn't know Mom told everyone you promised. That's messed up. I'm still mad, but I get it. I read that twice, my throat tightening. Then my sister sent another message. Next year, we need a real plan that doesn't assume you're free labor. I'm serious. Free labor. Seeing the words in black and white made me exhale slowly. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't an apology. But it was acknowledgement. I spent the rest of Christmas Day alone by choice. I made myself a simple dinner, watched a movie, and worked on my certification notes for a couple hours, not because I had to, but because it reminded me why I was doing this, why I was protecting my time. Late that night, as I was closing my laptop, my phone buzzed again. A private message from my mother. We need to talk after the holidays. Not like today. Really talk. I stared at the screen, my heart beating steadily. I knew that conversation would be the real test, not the chaos, not the ruined dinner. The quiet aftermath where patterns either reset or break. I didn't reply right away. I set the phone down and sat in the silence of my apartment, feeling the weight of what was coming. Because if my mother wanted to really talk, she would have to face the lie she built everything on. And I would have to decide how much truth I was willing to put on the table. The first missed call came just after dawn, when the sky was still that pale winter gray that makes everything feel unfinished. I was standing at my kitchen counter, flipping through my notes, trying to settle into a few hours of quiet work before the day pulled me in other directions. My phone buzzed once, then stopped. I didn't look at it right away. I knew who it would be. The second call came 3 minutes later. Longer this time. More insistent. I let it ring until it died on its own and went back to my notes, though the words on the page had started to blur. By the third call, my stomach tightened, not with panic, but with recognition. This was earlier than I expected. Whatever was happening, it wasn't unfolding neatly. It was spilling. I picked up my phone and checked the screen. Mom. No voicemail yet. That told me everything. When my mother left voicemails, it meant she was still trying to control the story. Silence meant she didn't know how. I took a breath and sat down at the table. The chair scraped softly against the floor, a small, ordinary sound that felt oddly grounding. I set my phone face up in front of me and waited. The message came next, a text this time short and sharp. Call me. Now. I didn't move. Another text followed almost immediately. We have a problem. I stared at the words and felt a strange calm settle over me. This was it. The moment where assumptions stopped being theoretical and turned into something real and heavy and impossible to ignore. I didn't call her back right away. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, feeling it cool my throat. I wanted my voice steady when I spoke. I wanted to hear clearly. My phone buzzed again, this time a call from my sister. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice came through breathless, tight. "Where are you?" "At home," I said. There was a pause, then a sharp exhale. "Mom said you were coming early. The kids are already here. All of them." I closed my eyes. "I told Mom I wasn't babysitting," I said. "That's not what she told us," my sister snapped. "She said you promised. She said you agreed weeks ago." I felt the familiar urge to explain, to soften, to absorb the shock. I let it pass. "I never promised anything," I said calmly. I told her I had other plans. Another pause. In the background, I could hear noise. A child crying. Someone calling a name. "This is a mess," my sister said. "She's freaking out." I imagined it then, not as a vague idea, but as a full picture. My mother's living room crowded with coats and bags. Kids already hyped up on sugar and excitement. Adults expecting relief that wasn't coming. "I know," I said. "You could still come," my sister said, and I could hear the hope in her voice. "Just for a bit. Just to get things under control." That word again. Control. "I can't," I said. She didn't argue. That told me how bad it already was. I hung up and sat there, my hands flat on the table, my heart beating steadily. I felt like I was standing just outside a house I had lived in my whole life, watching the walls shake as everything inside shifted. My phone rang again. "Mom." This time I answered. Her voice hit me like a wave, loud and frantic. "This cannot be happening," she said. "I don't understand what you're doing." I could hear the chaos behind her, children yelling a cartoon, blaring, someone knocking something over. The sound made my shoulders tense, but I didn't flinch. "What's happening?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Your brother dropped the kids off early," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "All of them. He said he thought you were here already. Your sister is late. I can't watch them and host. I can't do all of this." "You planned for me to do it," I said quietly. "Of course I did," she snapped. "That's what you always do." The words landed hard, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. "I told you I wasn't doing it this year," I said. "You said you would think about it," she shot back. "You didn't say no." "I didn't say yes either," I replied. "You shouldn't have told everyone," I agreed. There was a beat of stunned silence on the line. In the background, a child screamed high and sharp. "I told them because we needed a plan," she said, her voice shaking now. "Everyone made arrangements based on that." "You made arrangements based on an assumption," I said. Her breathing grew ragged. "You're abandoning us," she said. "On Christmas." I closed my eyes, steadying myself. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I said. "I'm refusing to be volunteered." A loud crash echoed through the phone, followed by crying. "This is impossible," she whispered. "I can't do this." For years, that sentence had been my cue. The moment where I stepped in, took over, made it manageable. My body remembered it, the old reflex sparking like a nerve. I didn't act on it. "You shouldn't have to," I said. "Not alone. But that doesn't make it my responsibility." Her voice hardened. "You're being cruel," she said. "You're punishing me." I listened to the noise behind her, the proof of what she had built without my consent. "Maybe I'm just letting you feel what I've been carrying," I said. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was smaller. "I told everyone you would be here," she said. "What am I supposed to say now?" "The truth," I thought. "Say whatever you need to," I said instead. "But don't put it on me." She hung up. I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, my phone heavy in my hand, my pulse loud in my ears. The first wave had hit. I knew there would be more. Minutes later, the group chat exploded. "Wait, what do you mean Lauren isn't coming?" "Mom, you said she promised. The kids are already here. Who is watching them?" My mother replied quickly, her words sharp. She changed her mind at the last minute. I don't know what's gotten into her. I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar heat rise in my chest. The old me would have stayed silent, let the story settle wherever it landed. This time, I typed. I didn't change my mind. I never agreed. I told Mom weeks ago I had other plans and wasn't babysitting. The typing dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. My brother wrote, "That's not what Mom told us." I know, I replied. My sister followed. "You told us she promised." There was a long pause before my mother answered. I did what I had to do. Someone needed to help. I felt something shift then, not inside me but in the group itself. The tone changed. Less certainty. More friction. "Why didn't you ask her?" my sister wrote. "You shouldn't have told us," she agreed. My brother added. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting the noise continue without me for a moment. My role had always been to step in when things reached this point. To soothe. To smooth. To sacrifice. Instead, I watched the consequences unfold in real time. My phone buzzed again, a video call this time. "Mom." I hesitated, then answered. Her face filled the screen, flushed and wild-eyed. Behind her, the house looked like a storm had blown through. Toys everywhere. Wrapping paper half torn. Kids moving in and out of frame, crying, shouting, fighting. "You need to see this," she said, angling the phone around. "This is what you left me with." I watched silently. "This is what I usually absorbed," I said. She snapped the camera back to her face. "You should be here," she said. "This is your responsibility." There it was. The word that had underpinned everything. Why, I asked. Why is it mine? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, I saw something flicker across her face, not anger, but fear. "Because you don't have kids," she said finally. "Because you're the only one who can handle this." "So my life is less important," I said quietly. She shook her head. "That's not what I meant." "But it is what you've treated it like," I replied. A child screamed off screen. Another started crying. My mother flinched but didn't look away from me. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "I built everything around you." I nodded slowly. "That's the problem." She stared at me, really stared, like she was seeing something she hadn't before. Or maybe something she had always refused to see. "You're really not coming," she said. "No," I said. Her face crumpled just for a second before she hardened again. "You're going to regret this," she said. Maybe, I replied. Or maybe you will. I ended the call. The silence that followed was heavy but clean. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. Somewhere across town, dinner plans were collapsing. Reservations were being canceled. Adults were scrambling, frustrated, overwhelmed. And for the first time, it wasn't because I failed to show up. It was because they had built something on me without asking, and the foundation had finally moved. My phone buzzed once more. A message from my sister. "This is chaos. I didn't realize how much you actually do." I read it, then set the phone down again. The house across the street flicked on its Christmas lights, bright and steady against the dark. I watched them glow, my breathing slow and even. The collapse was happening exactly where it should. And now that everything was exposed, there would be no going back to the way it was before. The next conversation would decide what came after the wreckage. The next call came late the following afternoon, when the initial shock had settled into something heavier and more dangerous. Anger cools into resentment. Panic turns into blame. I was at my kitchen table again, my laptop open, trying to pull myself back into my own life, my own work, the hours I had protected so fiercely. My notes were spread out in front of me, but my eyes kept drifting to the phone like it might bite. When it rang, I didn't jump this time. I stared at the screen until the vibration stopped. "Mom." A minute later, it rang again. then again. Not frantic the way it had been on Christmas Eve, but determined. The kind of persistence that meant she wasn't calling for help anymore. She was calling for control. I let it ring one more time, then answered. Her voice was lower than before, tightly contained. "We need to talk," she said. "I'm listening," I replied. There was a pause. I could hear background noise quieter now, like the house was finally calmer. The fact that she could call meant someone else was dealing with the kids. That alone told me the world hadn't ended. They had adjusted. "Your father is furious," she began, as if that was the most important fact. "He says you humiliated me. He says you embarrassed us in front of everyone." I didn't respond. I waited. "Your brother and sister are upset too," she continued. "Your sister cried last night. Your brother had to cancel dinner and it cost money. Do you understand what you did?" I took a slow breath. "I understand what happened," I said. "You built plans on something I never agreed to." Her tone sharpened. "Don't do that," she snapped. "Don't act like you had no part in this. You let it go. You didn't say no until it was too late." I felt the familiar pull, the urge to defend myself with a timeline, with details, with proof. I resisted it. I said no repeatedly, I replied. I said no in the beginning. I said no when you texted instructions. I said no when you announced it in the group chat. You heard what you wanted to hear. She inhaled sharply. "You never said no clearly," she insisted. "You know how you are. You hedge. You make everything vague so you don't look like the bad guy." The accusation stung because there was truth buried in it. I had hedged in the past. I had softened. I had tried to be reasonable in a family that used reasonable as a doorway back into compliance. But this time I didn't let her rewrite reality. "I told you I didn't agree to babysit," I said. "I told the group chat I didn't consent to being volunteered. That's clear." Her voice wavered for a moment, then hardened again. "So you decided to make an example out of me," she said. "That's what this was. A stunt. To teach me a lesson." I held the phone tighter, steadying my hand. "It wasn't a stunt," I said. "It was me refusing to keep being the solution to a problem you created." She let out a bitter laugh. "You think I created it?" she said. "You think I wanted 5 kids screaming in my house? Your brother and sister needed help. They work hard. They deserved one night off." "They deserved it at my expense," I replied quietly. There was a silence so thick I could hear her breathing. "You don't have children," she said finally. "You don't understand what it takes." I closed my eyes. "Not having children doesn't mean I don't have responsibilities," I said. "It doesn't mean my time is free. It doesn't mean my life is less important." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice sounded tired but still defensive. "We're family," she said. "Family helps. That's what we do." "Families ask," I said. "Families don't decide for each other and call it love." Her breath hitched like she wanted to interrupt, but I kept going, my voice calm and even. "You told everyone I promised when I didn't. You used my name to guarantee your plans. You put me in a position where if I said no, I looked selfish, and if I said yes, you got exactly what you wanted. That's not helping. That's manipulation." The word hung in the air between us. Manipulation. I could almost feel her recoil. "How dare you?" she whispered. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm not saying you're evil," I said. "I'm saying you've been doing this for years, and I've been letting you." Her silence was sharp. Then she spoke, and her voice turned brittle. "So what, you're just done with us? You're cutting us off. You're going to punish me forever because one Christmas went badly." I swallowed. I could hear the fear underneath her anger, the fear that her favorite system wasn't reliable anymore. "I'm not cutting anyone off," I said. "I'm changing the rules." Her laugh came out again, harsh. "Rules," she repeated. "Since when do you get to make rules?" Since I became the one who was always expected to bend, I replied. Since I realized I'm allowed to say no. Her voice rose. You could have told me sooner, she said. You could have sat down like an adult and talked to me instead of doing this. You blindsided me. I stared at the wall in front of me, feeling the old anger stir then settle. I tried to talk to you, I said. I told you I had plans. You laughed and said I could move them. You told me I was flexible. You told me I didn't have real responsibilities. You didn't want a conversation. You wanted compliance. She inhaled sharp and offended. I never said you didn't have responsibilities, she snapped. I felt my jaw tighten. You did, I said. You said everyone else has real responsibilities. You said I should be grateful they trust me with their kids. You said I'm the only one without a family of my own. I heard it. I've heard it my whole life. Silence. It wasn't the usual silence of her preparing a comeback. It was the kind of silence that means someone is searching for a way out of a corner they didn't realize they were in. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I didn't mean it the way you're taking it, she said. That was her favorite escape hatch. Intent over impact. It doesn't matter how you meant it, I replied. It matters how you acted. You acted like my time was yours to spend. Another pause. Then her voice shifted and I heard something new in it. Something that wasn't anger or guilt or fear. Shame. I didn't know what else to do, she said softly. I was overwhelmed. I wanted Christmas to be perfect. I needed help, and I knew if I asked you, you might say no. So I told everyone you agreed because I thought you wouldn't want to embarrass me. There it was. The truth spoken out loud. My chest tightened not with triumph but with grief. Grief that it was that simple. Not love, not respect, just strategy. Thank you for saying it, I said quietly. Because that's exactly what happened. Her voice cracked. I didn't think it would blow up like that, she whispered. I didn't think you would actually leave me with it. I didn't leave you, I said. I left the responsibility where it belonged. She started to cry, not loudly, but in that contained way she cried when she wanted sympathy without looking weak. Your father says you owe me an apology, she said through the tears. I felt something in me harden, not into cruelty, but into clarity. I'm not apologizing for refusing to be volunteered, I said. I'm not apologizing for saying no. If you want an apology, you can apologize to me for telling people I promised something I didn't. The quiet on the other end felt like a door closing. When she spoke again, her voice was small. You really mean this, don't you? Yes, I said. I really do. A long pause. Then in a voice that sounded like it cost her something, she said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I told them you agreed. I'm sorry I used you like that. The words weren't polished. They weren't dramatic. They were raw. And because of that, they landed. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't rush to say it was okay. I let the apology sit where it belonged, not as a bandage, but as a starting point. I appreciate you saying that, I said. But I need you to understand something. This can't happen again. She sniffed quiet. What do you want from me? She asked. I didn't hesitate. If you want me to babysit, you ask me directly, I said. You don't announce it to anyone until I say yes. And if I say no, you accept it. No guilt trips, no speeches about responsibility, no telling people I promised something I didn't. Her breathing sounded unsteady. And if you ever do it again, I continued, if you ever volunteer me and lie about it, I will step back. Not just from babysitting. From everything. I won't clean up the mess. I won't smooth it over. I won't protect your image at the expense of my peace. The silence that followed was long, and I could feel her weighing the threat not as drama, but as reality. That's harsh, she whispered. No, I said softly. What was harsh was expecting me to carry everyone else every year and calling it love. Another pause. Then she exhaled the sound weary. I don't know how to do this differently, she admitted. You learn, I said. The same way I'm learning. She didn't answer, but I could hear something shifting. Not fully. Not magically. But enough. Before we ended the call, she said one more thing, and her voice was quiet, almost afraid. Do you still want to come for dinner tonight? I stared at the table, thinking about the mess, the tension, the eyes that would be on me. I thought about the old version of myself walking into that house, already apologizing with my body shrinking to make everyone comfortable. Then I thought about the new version. Yes, I said. I'll come. But I'm coming as me, not as the babysitter. She swallowed audibly. Okay, she said. We hung up. I sat there for a long time afterward, my phone in my hand, feeling the strange mix of relief and exhaustion that comes after you finally say the thing you've swallowed for years. The confrontation wasn't a victory. It was a line drawn so clearly it couldn't be smudged back into the old shape. And as I stood up to get my coat ready to walk into whatever waited at my mother's house, I knew this was only the beginning of what it would take to make that line hold. I arrived at my mother's house just after dusk, when the sky had turned that deep winter blue, and the Christmas lights looked softer than they had earlier, like they were trying to calm things down. I sat in my car for a moment before getting out, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my breath steady but slow. This was usually the moment when I braced myself, when I rehearsed apologies I didn't owe, and prepared to step back into a role I had played for so long it felt stitched into my skin. This time, I didn't rehearse anything. I stepped out of the car and walked up the front path, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. Through the window, I could see movement, shadows crossing the walls, people cleaning up, regrouping. The chaos had passed, but the aftermath was everywhere. When I opened the door, the house smelled like reheated food and sugary drinks, that cloying mix that always lingered after a long day with kids. The living room was quieter than I expected. Toys were pushed into a corner instead of neatly arranged. A few cushions were out of place. The Christmas tree lights blinked steadily, stubbornly cheerful. My sister looked up first. She froze when she saw me, then straightened like she wasn't sure whether to hug me or glare. Hey, she said finally. Hey, I replied. There was an awkward pause, then she stepped aside to let me in. The kids were in the back room with my father, cartoons on low, their energy finally burned out. My brother stood by the kitchen counter, rubbing his temples, looking exhausted in a way I had rarely seen him before. When he saw me, his expression tightened, then softened, then settled into something complicated. So you really didn't do it? He said. I didn't, I replied. And I didn't agree to. He nodded slowly, like he was replaying the last 24 hours in his head with new information. That explains a lot, he said quietly. My mother appeared from the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel that didn't need it. She stopped when she saw me, and for a moment she just looked at me like she was trying to recognize someone familiar in a slightly different shape. You came, she said. I said I would, I replied. For dinner. She nodded and gestured toward the table. We're almost ready, she said. Sit down if you want. I set my coat over the back of a chair and sat, my movements calm, deliberate. No one rushed to hand me a child. No one immediately started listing tasks. That alone felt surreal. Dinner was quieter than usual. Not tense exactly, but cautious. Like everyone was learning how to move around a room where the furniture had been rearranged overnight. My father cleared his throat halfway through the meal. Well, he said this year was different. No one laughed. My sister pushed her food around her plate, then looked up at me. I didn't realize how much you usually do, she said. I mean, I knew you helped, but yesterday was a lot. I met her gaze. It's always a lot, I said gently. You just weren't the ones feeling it. My brother nodded, his jaw tight. We shouldn't have assumed, he said. Mom told us you agreed, and we didn't question it. That's on us too. My mother stiffened slightly but didn't interrupt. I appreciate you saying that, I replied. There was another pause. Then my mother spoke, her voice careful. I shouldn't have told everyone you promised, she said. I already apologized for that. I didn't look at her right away. When I did, I kept my voice steady. Thank you, I said. That matters. She swallowed clearly, uncomfortable with the fact that the apology didn't instantly restore the old balance. After dinner, the kids were settled with a movie, and the adults drifted back into the living room. Normally, this was when I would have been tidying up, managing bedtime, stepping in wherever needed. Instead, I sat on the couch with a cup of tea and let myself exist. My father sat across from me, studying me in that quiet way he had. Your mother says you've been holding on to a lot, he said. I smiled faintly. That's one way to put it. He nodded. I wish we had seen it sooner. I didn't respond. I wasn't here for wishes. Later, when the kids were finally asleep and the house had settled into that deep, late-night quiet, my mother asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so many plans had been made without me. The overhead light cast a soft circle around us, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't bring notes. I brought myself. I don't want things to stay like this, she said, twisting her hands together. I don't want us to be distant. Neither do I said. But I don't want things to go back to how they were either. She nodded slowly. I didn't realize how much I leaned on you, she said. I told myself it was because you were strong, because you could handle it. But yesterday, when you weren't there, I realized how much I had built around that assumption. I waited. I don't want to be that person, she continued. The one who uses her daughter and calls it family. Her voice cracked just slightly. I believe you, I said. But believing you isn't the same as trusting that it won't happen again. She flinched, then nodded. What do you need from me? She asked. I didn't rush this answer. I need you to ask, I said. Every time. I need you to accept no without punishing me for it. And I need you to stop speaking for me to other people. She nodded again, more firmly this time. I can do that, she said. I will do that. I held her gaze. And I need you to understand that if it happens again, I will step back. I won't explain. I won't argue. I won't clean it up. Her shoulders sagged. I hear you, she said. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not awkward, just quiet. When I finally stood to leave, she hugged me, not tightly, not desperately, but carefully, like she was learning how. Driving home, the night felt different. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. Like fog had lifted just enough to see the road ahead. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. The group chat slowed. My siblings checked in without asking for anything. My mother sent a message asking how my work was going, not what I was doing for everyone else. I didn't trust it completely. Not yet. Change that comes from shock can fade when comfort returns. 2 weeks later, my phone rang while I was sorting laundry. My mother's name flashed on the screen. I answered. I've been thinking, she said. About next year. About how we do holidays. I waited. I don't want to assume anything anymore, she continued. I want to plan without counting on you as a solution. And if we need help, I want to ask you properly. And if you say no, I want to respect it. Her voice was steady, not performative. That's a start, I said. She hesitated. There's something else, she added. Your sister mentioned a barbecue in the spring. Just family time. No kids dumped on you. She asked me if it was okay to invite you without expectations. I smiled to myself. That sounds nice, I said. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about how strange it felt to be invited instead of assigned. How unfamiliar it still was to be considered without being needed. I didn't fool myself into thinking everything was fixed. Years of patterns don't dissolve in weeks. But something fundamental had shifted. They had seen what happened without me. They had felt the weight I carried. And most importantly, they had learned that my presence was a choice, not a guarantee. As I lay down that night staring at the ceiling, I knew the final test wasn't over yet. Forgiveness was one thing, forgetting was another. And maintaining this new balance would require something I had never practiced before: holding my ground when things felt calm again. The next chapter of this story wouldn't be about chaos or confrontation. It would be about whether respect could survive comfort. Spring arrived quietly, the way it always does when you are no longer bracing for impact. I noticed it one morning while I was walking to my car. The air softer, the light gentler, the world no longer feeling like it was pressing its weight against my chest. That was when I realized something had changed for good, not because my family had promised anything, but because I had. The barbecue my sister mentioned actually happened. That alone felt like a small miracle. She texted me the details instead of assuming. "Just a heads up, we're thinking Saturday afternoon, no pressure, no kid duty, just hanging out if you want." I stared at that message longer than I probably should have, letting the words settle. No pressure, no duty, just hanging out. I said yes, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. When I arrived, nothing was waiting for me to fix. No one handed me a diaper bag. No one asked me to take the kids so they could relax. My mother hugged me careful again, like she was still learning where the line was. My brother manned the grill. My sister chased her kids across the yard, laughing but tired in a way that looked honest. At one point, my mother caught my eye and smiled, a small, genuine smile that didn't ask anything from me. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments. There always are when a family stops pretending. But it was real. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the noise softened, my mother sat beside me on the patio. She didn't start with an apology or a justification. She just said something simple. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you until you weren't there." I nodded. "I didn't realize how much it cost me until I stopped," I replied. She didn't argue. That mattered more than any grand speech. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale after that. Boundaries don't magically erase old instincts. There were moments when my phone rang and my body still tensed, expecting a request disguised as a need. There were times when my mother hesitated too long before asking something, unsure if she was allowed. Change, I learned, is clumsy before it is steady. But the difference was this: when I said no, the world didn't end. When I said yes, it was because I chose to. And when my family made plans, they no longer built them on my silence. A few months later, my mother asked if I could watch the kids for an evening. She asked. She didn't tell anyone else. She didn't decorate it with guilt or urgency. I checked my schedule and said no, not because I couldn't help, but because I didn't want to. She paused, then said, "Okay." That was it. I sat on my couch after that call, heart pounding, waiting for the backlash that never came. No angry texts, no sighs of disappointment, no reminder of everything she had done for me. Just acceptance. That was when I understood something important. The real revenge was never the chaos of that Christmas. It was the quiet that came after, when the old pattern didn't snap back into place. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty, if I think I went too far, if I regret letting my family struggle that holiday. I think about it honestly every time. I think about my mother's gasp, the disbelief, the mess. And then I think about the years before that, the missed moments, the swallowed words, the way my life kept shrinking to make room for everyone else. I don't feel guilty anymore. I feel awake. Because what I learned is this: being a good daughter does not mean being endlessly available. Loving your family does not require sacrificing yourself until there is nothing left. And boundaries are not punishments. They are invitations to treat you better. My family didn't change overnight. But they changed enough. And more importantly, I did. Next Christmas might look different. I might be there laughing, helping, choosing to be present. Or I might be somewhere else entirely honoring my own plans without apology. Either way, the choice will be mine. If you've ever been the one everyone leans on, the one whose time is treated like it's free, the one who is praised for being strong but never protected because of it, I want you to know this. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to let other people feel the weight they've handed you for years. And you are allowed to choose yourself without becoming the villain in your own story. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived some version of it, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you would have drawn the line, or if you already have. And if you want more stories like this, stories about boundaries, justice, and finally being seen, stay with me. There's more to come.